Okay, so you want to own a pizza shop. Not invest in one from a distance. Not eat at one on a Friday night. Own one. Sign the lease yourself. Hire the staff yourself. Put your own name on the loan. Here's why that idea is so seductive in the first place. Pizza is the one food business that looks like it can't fail. Everybody eats it. The ingredients are cheap. The equipment isn't complicated. An oven, a mixer, a walk-in cooler. You've probably driven past a shop doing steady business every single night of the week and thought, that's not hard. That's just dough and cheese and a 15-minute drive. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that math is wrong and why the gap between looks profitable and is actually profitable swallows more pizza shops than almost any other category of restaurant. Because here's the part that breaks people's brains. A pizza shop can be doing $700,000 a year in sales. Packed every Friday night. A line at the counter. Delivery drivers in and out the whole evening. And the person who owns it can still be taking home less than a warehouse shift supervisor. Not because they're bad at business. Because the economics of pizza are quietly stacked against the person holding the lease in ways that don't show up on the day you sign it. Only 2 or 3 years later, once you've already put $300,000 into the building. And the tricky part is, nothing about that failure mode is visible from the outside. You can walk past a pizza shop with a packed dining room, a driver pulling out of the lot every 4 minutes, and a line of teenagers waiting for their order, and have absolutely no idea whether the person who owns it is quietly building wealth or quietly bleeding out 3 months from missing a lease payment. Revenue and profit stopped being the same word a long time ago in this business. Almost nobody outside the industry realizes how far apart they've drifted. So we're going to open the whole thing up, layer by layer. What it actually costs to buy in, and the fork between building your own brand or renting somebody else's. What's hiding inside the ingredient math, and why the number on your menu was never the real story. The staffing trap almost nobody sees coming until their 3rd or 4th month in business. The delivery apps, they're quietly taking 1/3 of every order that comes through your door. What's genuinely left over once every single one of those costs has been paid. And why the only people who get truly generationally wealthy from pizza are almost never the ones standing behind the counter making it. First, let's talk about what it actually costs to get the keys. If you go independent, no brand, no franchise fee, just you and a landlord, you're looking at somewhere between $175,000 and $750,000 to open the doors. That's not a typo range. That spread comes down to 3 variables. The size of the space, whether you're building a full dining room or keeping it takeout and delivery only, and how much of the kitchen you're constructing from scratch versus inheriting from whatever restaurant occupied the space before you. Equipment alone, the pizza ovens, the prep tables, the dough mixers, the walk-in refrigeration, runs $50,000 to $150,000, and that's before a single tomato has been bought. Rent adds another $1,000 to $7,000 a month, depending on the market, with coastal metros running 2 to 3 times what a mid-sized Midwest city charges for the same square footage. And once you've signed for the space, you still need 3 to 6 months of operating cash sitting in reserve, because a new pizza shop doesn't hit its stride on day one. It builds a customer base slowly, order by order, while the bills keep arriving on schedule regardless. Now here's the fork in the road. You can go franchise instead, and the pitch is obvious. A proven system, a recognized name, and a playbook somebody else already stress-tested across thousands of locations. Domino's franchise costs run from around $107,000 to $744,000, depending on the store type, and Domino's is actually one of the cheaper national brands to buy into. Pizza Hut runs from $367,000 all the way up to $2 million for a full-format location. You're not just buying a kitchen anymore at that point. You're buying an entire system, and systems come with rent attached that never goes away. That permanent rent is the royalty. Domino's takes 5.5% of your weekly gross sales off the top, plus another 5 to 8% for national and local marketing. Add it together, and you're handing over more than 11.5% of everything that comes through the register before you've paid a single employee, before you've bought a single pound of mozzarella. Not until the loan is paid off. forever, for as long as you hold that franchise agreement. So the independent route saves you the royalty, but you're building the brand, the systems, and the customer trust completely from zero, on your own dime, with no franchisor playbook to fall back on if you get the ratios wrong in your first year. There's also a cost almost nobody budgets for on either path. The paperwork before the pizza. Health department permits, a liquor license if you're pouring beer, fire suppression systems over the oven line, and general liability and workers' comp insurance that a lender will require before they'll release a single dollar of your loan. None of that shows up in the glossy startup cost range you saw in a franchise brochure, and all of it has to be paid before you've made a single sale. Franchise territories add one more wrinkle. Domino's requires a minimum net worth of $250,000 and at least $75,000 in liquid, spendable cash just to qualify as a franchisee in the first place, which quietly filters out most people who need a loan to cover the buy-in on top of that. Anyway, both roads land you in the exact same place, a lease you're personally on the hook for, and a business that hasn't sold a single slice yet. The buy-in isn't the real risk in owning a pizza shop. The buy-in is just the entry fee. The risk is everything that happens after you unlock the door for the first time. Next, let's talk about the thing that actually eats your margin before a single customer has even walked in: the ingredients themselves. Every pizza shop, independent or franchise, runs on the same rule of thumb. Food cost has to land between 28% and 32% of sales. Go higher than that, and there's structurally not enough revenue left to cover rent, staff, and a paycheck for you. Go lower than that, and your pizza probably isn't very good because somewhere along the line you skimped on cheese to protect the number. Here's why that band is so unforgiving to work inside of. Cheese and flour aren't stable, predictable inputs. They move with dairy futures and wheat harvests, sometimes swinging double digits in a single season. And a pizza shop has almost no ability to pass that cost increase straight through to a customer who's used to paying $18 for a large. You can't reprint your menu board every time mozzarella spikes. Domino's own quarterly earnings talk about this exact pressure. Rising costs and what they call the food basket, squeezing store-level margins even at a company with the buying power to negotiate supply contracts most independent owners could never touch. If a company posting over $1 billion in quarterly revenue still feels that squeeze, an independent shop buying cheese by the case feels it a great deal worse. So the math looks deceptively clean on paper. A large pizza sells for $18. The ingredients underneath it might cost $5.50. That's a 69% gross margin, which sounds extraordinary until you remember that number still has to cover the box, the labor to make it, the oven running the whole shift whether the store is busy or dead, the rent, the insurance, and the loan payment. The ingredient margin was never the business. It was only ever the first cut and the easiest one to look at and feel good about. Break that $5.50 down further and the fragility gets clearer. Roughly half of it is cheese alone, the single most volatile line item on the entire ingredient list, because unlike flour or tomatoes, mozzarella doesn't store well and can't be bought 6 months ahead at a locked and priced the way a smart independent owner might hedge on flour. The rest splits between dough, sauce, toppings, and the box itself, which sounds trivial until you remember every single pizza that leaves the building needs its own box. And cardboard pricing moves with fuel costs the same way everything else in the supply chain does. This is where most first-time owners get the story wrong. They price against ingredient cost and assume the rest takes care of itself. But ingredient cost is the cheapest, most visible layer in the entire stack, which means it's also the layer that hides the most damage happening quietly underneath it. Anyway, the pizza looks profitable the moment it comes out of the box. Whether the shop is actually profitable depends entirely on everything we haven't gotten to yet. Now we get to the layer that does the most damage of all, and does it the quietest: labor. A pizza shop needs people making dough, people answering the phones and the app orders, people assembling and running the oven, and if you're delivering yourself instead of routing through an app, drivers complete with their own vehicle insurance and liability exposure. None of these are especially high-skill jobs on their own, but together they demand constant, overlapping coverage because a pizza shop's busiest window is a single 2-hour stretch on a Friday or Saturday night, and you have to be fully staffed for that window, even though it represents a small fraction of your total operating hours for the week. That's the trap hiding inside the schedule. You can't staff for your average hour. You have to staff for your peak hour, which means for most of the week you're paying people to stand in a kitchen that isn't full. And that leads directly to the next hidden cost, turnover. Quick service and pizza rolls run some of the highest turnover rates in the entire economy. Workers cycling through every few months, chasing whichever shop is paying 50 cents more an hour. Every time that happens, you're not just covering wages. You're retraining from zero, and an undertrained new hire on a Friday night is slower on the line, wastes more dough, and burns more pizzas than the person they just replaced. Layer rising minimum wages on top of that. California's fast food minimum sits at $20 an hour heading into 2026, and labor alone can run close to a third of every sales dollar in higher cost markets. Between food and labor combined, you can already be 55 to 60 cents of every dollar gone. And you haven't touched rent, utilities, insurance, or the loan payment yet. And there's a labor cost that never shows up on a payroll report at all. Yours. Most independent owners aren't sitting in an office reviewing numbers. They're on the line, covering the shift nobody else showed up for, because the alternative is either paying overtime you can't afford or watching a Friday night go sideways with half the staff you need. The paycheck we're about to calculate assumes you're already working full-time inside your own business, not managing it from a distance. So before we get into what's actually left over once all of that is paid, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand how businesses like this really work underneath the surface, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down the real economics of ownership, one business at a time, and there's a new one every week. Anyway, back to the pizza shop and the two costs left that decide whether any of this was worth it. Here's the part that breaks people's brains hardest, and it's the one most people opening a pizza shop in 2026 don't fully price in until it's too late. Third-party delivery apps, the DoorDashes, the Uber Eats, take between 15% and 30% of every order they bring you, depending on the plan tier you sign up for. On a business that's already netting single digits after food and labor, that commission isn't a marketing line item. It's the exact difference between the shop being profitable and the shop quietly losing money on every single app order it fills, even while the register keeps ringing. Even Domino's, which spent decades building its own in-house delivery fleet specifically to avoid this exact tax, brought DoorDash on as a channel in 2025. Not because it's cheap, but because refusing to be where the customer already is costs the business more than the commission does. Tellingly, Domino's own investor materials now describe carryout, not delivery, as the larger and more structurally profitable share of orders. That single fact tells you everything about how the industry actually feels about delivery economics right now from the inside. For an independent shop with none of Domino's negotiating leverage or fleet infrastructure, the math is brutal. You either eat the 15 to 30% commission and watch your already thin margin evaporate on every third-party order, or you refuse the platforms entirely and lose the customers who've long since stopped calling Pizza Shop directly. Run the actual dollars on one order. A $30 delivery ticket on a 30% commission tier hands $9 straight to the app before you've paid for a single ingredient. Pull your 28 to 32% food cost off the remaining $21, and you're left covering labor, rent, and the loan on roughly $15 for an order that would have netted you almost twice that if the customer had simply called the shop directly. Multiply that gap across hundreds of orders a week, and the app isn't a convenience anymore. It's a second landlord, charging rent on every transaction instead of once a month. There's no clean way out of this one. You're not choosing between winning and losing. You're choosing which version of losing money you'd prefer. The apps didn't just take a cut of your revenue. They took the one asset a pizza shop used to own outright, the direct relationship with the customer who's deciding what's for dinner tonight. So after all of that, food, labor, rent, royalties, delivery commissions, what's actually left for the person who signed the lease? For an independent shop, once it's established and running smoothly, owners typically net 5 to 12% after food cost and take home somewhere between $30,000 and $70,000 in their first year. Once the shop matures and the early kinks are worked out, that climbs to $60,000 to $120,000. That's the honest range, not the number printed in a franchise brochure, the number independent owners actually report earning. Franchise economics look different, and this is where the specific brand you chose starts to matter enormously. Domino's discloses more financial detail than almost any franchisor in the country, and their numbers tell a very specific story. The median store does roughly $1.4 million a year in sales, and the typical owner nets around $186,000 annually off that volume, once royalties, marketing fees, and everything else has come out. That's a real, franchise disclosed figure, not a projection built to sell territories. But notice what actually made that number work. It wasn't a better pizza recipe. It was volume. $1.4 million in annual sales is nearly double what a typical independent pizzeria does in a year, according to industry data from PMQ Pizza magazine. Domino's franchisees aren't out earning independence because Domino's pizza tastes better. They're out earning independence because Domino's built an operational system that lets one store push almost twice the throughput through the same rent, the same oven, and the same four walls, with a centralized supply chain that keeps ingredient costs lower than what an independent owner pays buying cheese by the case, one delivery at a time. Little Caesars took the opposite approach to the same problem, and it's worth understanding why, because it proves the same point from the other direction. For decades, Little Caesars deliberately skipped delivery altogether and built its entire model around low overhead and carry-out speed. The hot and ready format, ready before you even walk in. No delivery fleet to fund, no third-party app commission to absorb, and a menu narrow enough that a small crew can run it at high speed. It's a third largest in the country pizza chain built almost entirely on subtraction, stripping out the cost centers that were quietly bleeding everyone else, rather than trying to out-earn them. That's the real lesson sitting inside these numbers. In pizza, profit was never a function of how good the food is. It's a function of how much volume your system can push through the exact same fixed costs every single owner is already paying, or, just as often, how many of those fixed costs your system was smart enough to never take on in the first place. Which brings us to the only version of this business that produces real, generational wealth. And it isn't the shop. In 1960, Tom Monahan and his brother borrowed $900 and put down a $500 deposit to take over a single pizza place in Ypsilanti, Michigan. He didn't get rich from that one store. He got rich because he turned it into a repeatable system, then franchised that system across thousands of locations he never personally had to run himself. In 1998, after 38 years, Monahan sold roughly 93% of Domino's to Bain Capital for about $1 billion. 19 years earlier, in 1959, on the other side of Michigan, Mike and Marion Litch had done almost exactly the same thing with $10,000 in life savings, opening a single storefront called Little Caesars Pizza Treat. By the time Micah Litch died in 2017, the family's holdings were worth an estimated $6.1 billion. And in a detail that ties this whole story together neatly, in 1992, it was a Litch who bought the Detroit Tigers from Tom Monahan for $85 million. Two men, two single pizza storefronts a few decades apart, two of the largest personal fortunes ever built out of dough and cheese. Neither fortune came from running a great shop. Both came from building a system that thousands of other people paid to run on their behalf. That's the split that defines pizza as an industry, top to bottom. The franchisee owns the shop, the lease, the staff, and the daily grind of the Friday night rush, and nets somewhere between $60,000 and $186,000 a year if everything goes right. The franchisor owns the system itself, collects a royalty from every single one of those shops simultaneously, and never once has to worry about a Friday night rush at all. Zoom out, and the pattern holds across the entire industry, not just these two names. Pizza is roughly a $46 billion category in the United States, according to PMQ Pizza magazine's industry data, and the overwhelming majority of that revenue flows through franchise systems, not independent operators. Every dollar of it eventually passes through a franchisee's hands first, absorbing the food cost swings, the labor turnover, and the app commissions on the way through. Only a fraction of it ever reaches a franchisor who never touched the dough. One person owns a pizza shop. The other person owns pizza shops, plural, without ever personally touching a single one of them. Both of them can honestly say they're in the pizza business. Only one of them is exposed to everything we just walked through. So the pizza shop makes sense once you see it clearly. Thin margins, brutal labor timing, and a business that only really compounds into wealth at scale for someone who isn't the one standing behind counter. But there's a version of this same pattern. Thin margins, heavy physical assets, and a business that only really works at massive scale, sitting inside an industry most people never think to examine at all. The trucks and warehouses moving the flour, the cheese, and the boxes from a supplier to a shop like this one, long before your dinner ever reaches your door. That's logistics. And it turns out the economics of owning a logistics company follow a rule even stranger than pizzas, where the biggest players in the industry don't need to own a single truck to control the entire supply chain running underneath them. That's next.